I'm Carrie Bourne. I have done this too many times to screw up that part. I am from the Office of Continuing Education at UW-Whitewater, and we coordinate the Fairhaven Lecture Series every semester. We schedule 10 or so lectures on a theme, and this semester we've been talking all about World War I. And we're going to finish up today with Dr. Karl Brown. Dr. Brown is an assistant professor in the Department of History at UW-Whitewater. He received his PhD and MA from the University of Texas at Austin and his BA from Lawrence University in Appleton. His research focuses on society in post-war Eastern Europe, particularly communist Hungary in the late 1940s through mid-1950s. In addition to his teaching and research work at several institutions in the U.S., Dr. Brown has worked as the lead brewer at breweries in Japan and the director of brewing operations at Greek Brewery in Athens. You might remember he was here with us at Fairhaven just a couple months ago to talk about the history of beer. Today we'll hear about what he has to say about post-World War I. Please welcome Dr. Karl Brown.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you. And we should also thank Carrie Bourne for all the work she does, as well as everybody else with Continuing Ed. These guys are great. They go to so much work. They do such a great job of it. It's always a treat to come and talk here at Fairhaven. Sorry, how's my sound? Can y'all? Oh, that's better, isn't it? Okay, good. Well, as you know, historians tend to be long-winded, pompous, and use lots of trivia in their talks. So I'll try not to be long-winded. That's what I can guarantee you pretty much. I want to look at three kind of episodes in the immediate aftermath of World War I, okay? First, I think that the imposition of Marxist rule in Russia, now the Soviet Union, is I think one of the more important elements going into the immediate post-war period, because this in turn is going to inform what happens with the formation of states in Eastern and Central Europe, most notably Czechoslovakia after the war. And then we'll wrap up with sort of a weird little episode from Greco-Turkish history that many of you might not be familiar with. That is the episode of King Alexander's monkey. And then I'm going to wrap things up entirely with the pondering in broad terms when and why things happen, broadly speaking, in history. Kind of an ambitious goal, so bear with me as I get through that, okay? I have a picture of the Communist Party here, upper left, of course, you can tell. Sorry, let's just move on. As we all know, industrialization comes along, hits Europe in the late 18th and 19th century, and this results in a real sort of a coalescence of two classes, right? The haves and the have-nots, the bourgeoisie who own the means of production, and the workers, the proletariat, who can only sell their labor for works in factories. So this, many families manage to benefit from industrialization and capitalism. Many more, however, find themselves working in factories in grimy work conditions such as these, an entire suburbs and tenement houses of pretty grim existence. Child labor is commonplace. Children as young as 6 and 7 years old working 12 to 14 hours a week in the factory. And it's these conditions that inspired Karl Marx to write the Communist Manifesto in 1848, right? Now, most of you probably remember a fair bit of this from high school or college or whenever. But to summarize, Marx argues that over time, the proletariat, that is the working class, is going to gradually grow in power to where they finally overthrow the bourgeoisie, that is the elites, and then everybody's going to live happily ever after in a classless society, in essence, right? A somewhat utopian vision. But something to keep in mind about Marx is that I think too often communism and Marxism in this country is filtered through the prism of the Cold War. Right? That is, for 50 years there, the Soviets were the bad guys, the U.S. were the good guys, and it was a very sort of a black and white picture. I think that, and therefore, whereas the West is civilized, Marxism was barbaric or a throwback in some sense, right? I think it's important to keep in mind that Marxism is actually a very enlightened idea in the sense of the Enlightenment. The original capital Enlightenment going back to the 18th century, right? That is that human beings are improvable through education or through good society, things like that. And if human beings are improvable, we can use science to figure out our situation, then we can gradually improve the human condition throughout history. I think this is a tenet of Enlightenment thought going back to Adam Smith, to John Locke. It's also present in Marx. It's just the way that it manifests in history is going to be very, very different, as we all know, okay? Any case, coming out of the 19th century, Marx is looking at the conditions of the working class in Europe. He's trying to figure out how to make that better. He comes up with the solution of overthrowing the bourgeoisie. Nothing much happens on those grounds until the early 20th century. That is, there are a couple of failed Marxist revolutions here and there, most notably the Paris Commune in 1871. But along comes Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov, or Lenin, probably Marx's major disciple. Now, Lenin is a Russian. He's born in 1870. He lives in exile for 20 years from his teen years onwards. And he is exposed to the work of Marx. He decides to try to foment a Marxist revolution in Russia. And the problem with doing so is that Russia lags way behind the rest of Europe and the US at this point in time, right? That is, it is mostly agricultural. The population is, I think, 50% peasant and, 50% illiterate, 80% peasant on the eve of the revolution. So keep in mind that Marx's paradigm really fits the industrialized working class, which is nowhere to be found in Russia, right? So Lenin, in essence, has to manipulate Marxist thought to fit Russia. What he comes up with is a sort of a three-pronged approach to making Marxism work in Russia. Okay. Now, first off, we're going to have some band of professional revolutionaries, like the Bolsheviks, led by somebody like Lenin, who will be in charge of things and make everything turn out the way they're supposed to. And secondly, he envisions that even though there aren't that many workers as yet, those that there are class-conscious and radical enough that they can form a sort of alliance, or a smichka in Russian, with the peasantry, in essence dragging the peasants along into revolutionary consciousness. And thirdly, Lenin realizes that if the revolution happens only in Russia, it's going to fail. He envisions starting the revolution in Russia as a way of springboarding it or spreading it there out throughout the rest of the globe thereafter, okay? Now, again, so in essence, a band of professional revolutionaries leading the show, workers and peasants working together towards revolution and starting the revolution in Russia and then spreading it throughout the globe. I'm not sure Marx would have agreed this is Marxism. The whole thing about peasants instead of workers being revolutionary, Marx would have had problems with. And again, Russia's the last place, if not on earth in Europe at least, that you would envision a classic Marxist-style, worker-driven revolution happening. In any case, Lenin is able to convince enough of his fellow Russians of the wisdom of his analysis, and he'll end up being very important in 1917. Before I move on, I should mention that Lenin was always very cognizant of Russia's backwardsness. He knew that that in order to bring socialism to Russia, we would have to modernize the country as well. This leads to one of his more famous quotes: "That communism is socialism, the political model, plus the electrification of the countryside. We have to take all these peasant villages, we got to give them electricity, infrastructure, sewage, plumbing, basically transform society in terms of technology as well as politics." This is his vision, okay? Again, open question as to how actually Marxist this is. This is how he decides to apply Marxist thought to Russia. So, going into World War I, Russia lags well behind her Western counterparts. Serfdom, that is a peasantry tied to the land, very similar to slavery, remains the law until 1861, at which point serfs are freed, but they're not able to buy land. So that this isn't really that good for them. The Tsar Alexander II is assassinated in 1881, leading to a sort of a police state led by the Okhrana, or secret police, that cracks down on all dissent. And then in 1904, 1905, the Russians are defeated by the Japanese, which leads to the 1905 revolution. What happens in this photograph, we have Father Gapon, Orthodox priest, marching up to the Winter Palace with a crowd of unarmed women and children, trying to present a petition asking for democracy, civil rights, and the rest. And the Tsar's troops fire upon them, murdering hundreds of innocent people and sparking revolution all throughout Russia. Right? Now, the Tsar rapidly loses control, and he realizes that in order to get it back, he has to promise the people something. This is the origin of the October Manifesto, where he promises a constitution, representative parliament, various other things like that. The Russians, convinced, go back to work, at which point the Tsar promptly reneges on his promises. Fool you once, shame on you, in essence, right? So Russia, on the eve of World War I, remains very backwards vis-a-vis Europe in terms of being mostly unindustrialized, and most of the popularity living on the land rather than cities. And there's also this example from 1905 of the Tsar having promised reform once and then promptly reneged on that promise. Okay, this is all on Russians' minds going into World War I. The quick map of Europe on the eve of the war. Again, the Russian Empire covers over 1/6 of the world's surface. It's a pretty massive empire, but some serious weaknesses present as well, okay? the World War I goes very poorly for the Russians from the get-go. They're defeated by the German armies led by Hindenburg at the Battle of Tannenberg Lakes. And this is important for a couple reasons. First off, the Czar Nicholas II decides to go off to the front and lead the war effort personally. This is a bad idea. He's not that good a general. It gets worse because he's leaving Moscow in the hands of his wife Alexandra, and also the Mad Monk Rasputin, which you've all heard of at some point, I suspect, all this mythology about him and everything. But in essence, the Tsar is away at the front. His wife has fallen under the spell of this peculiar political figure, and the home front dissolves into chaos even as Russians continue to go storming to the front and dying fruitlessly in offensive after offensive. Okay, so the same type of disenchantment and dissatisfaction with the war that sets in France, Britain, and Germany is present in Russia from the outset, and just gets worse and worse throughout the course of 1915, 16, and early 1917. Okay. Thus, February 1917, a massive popular revolt against the Tsar that is people from all walks of life, from the peasantry to the bourgeoisie to the workers to the nobles. None of them like the Tsar anymore. He's seen to have failed as a ruler, and in essence, that all of Russia is united looking for change in February. Now, at the time, the Bolsheviks, I mean, they're pretty much a handful of revolutionaries meeting and plotting in Petrograd and elsewhere, but they're able to gain enough power by October to stage a coup and overthrow the provisional government, seizing power for themselves, at least in Moscow and Petrograd. Okay. However, many elements in Russian society that were happy with the initial February popular revolution don't like the Bolsheviks. They want to see something more like a Western constitutional democracy or something like that. So the coup in October is a sign for civil war breaking out, and this will last in Tsarist Russia, the Soviet Union, for the next 3 years. Okay. Let me stop. Does anybody have any questions so far? I've been told I speak too swiftly. I apologize. Any questions? No? Okay, because this is what's going on in Eastern Europe as the peacemakers are meeting at Versailles. They're very concerned about the spread of Marxism, and this will get us to Masaryk shortly, okay? The Civil War, first off, the Soviets, the Reds, now the Bolsheviks, now the Soviets, find themselves controlling Moscow and Petrograd, a handful of other cities, but they're besieged on all sides by the White armies. There's remnants of the Tsarist armies. There's Cossacks attacking from the east. The U.S. is actually occupying Arkhangelsk. We actually occupied part of Russia during their Civil War. Many Americans don't know that. And over time, though, the Reds are able to win the Russian Civil War. They lose a lot of territory in the West, but Lenin and his cohort are able to consolidate rule as a union of Soviet Socialist Republics, or USSR, in 1921. Okay. Now, before we turn to Central Europe, I want to take a moment and ask us to rethink what we know about Marxism in the Soviet Union. Okay, I mean, it has a very bad stereotype here in the West, again, because they were our mortal enemies for the duration of the Cold War, right? But the striking thing about Marxism, at least early on, in this idealistic phase, before Stalin comes along and turns it into a totalitarian police state, is that there were a number of people who genuinely believed in the Marxist project of making life better for everybody, regardless on their income. And during the early days of the revolution especially, they tried to bring this vision, they tried to render this vision in concrete form, as is trying to create an egalitarian society in which everybody was able to contribute according to their best ability and get back from it according to their needs, right? So we have a vision of equality in dress, have everybody dressed the same so that we can't tell class differences from the way they're dressed. We see this idea here. This is a kind of a bizarre post where it's talking about fusing the political revolution in the Soviet Union with the American means of production, Fordism, the assembly line, things like that, that is maximizing the productive capability of humans, that is by borrowing from American culture itself, right? And also in photography, we have the work of Rodchenko, Alexander Rodchenko, who's one of the founders of modern design theory, among other things. In architecture, this is probably my favorite idea anybody had in the Soviet Revolution. I mean, Victor Tatlin built this model of a structure that was supposed to be built at some point in the future in Moscow. It was never built because the whole thing was supposed to be about 400 meters tall, about as tall as the World Trade Center, and and it was also things that Tatlin wanted to invest. We wanted to get people to think hard about what architecture and monumentality and what buildings meant. So his vision for the structure was this massive 400-meter tall structure that also rotated. That is, each of those sleeves rotated at a different speed, at a different direction. The outer ring would rotate once per month, the next one once per week, the next one once per day, the top one once per hour. So as you would walk up to this building, their entire thing would be moving, not like buildings are supposed to. Moreover, it would have a radio antenna broadcasting good class-conscious content throughout the land, as well as on the very top, a very powerful movie projector to broadcast movies onto low-hanging clouds on overcast nights. Okay, so it's not just a building; it's a media center. It's supposed to be the revolution incarnate, in essence, right? Also, in cinema, of course, you have Eisenstein and Vertov, other directors who simply transform how people think about cinema. They remain some of the most important directors to this day, regardless of their politics. Okay, so the point is that this early phase of Marxist rule in Russia, again before Stalin comes along and turns into a police state, there's a remarkable moment of creativity and inspiration going on here. And for artists, the great part of it is that for the first time in possibly history, they're not relying on the market. Right? That is, the state has Prolet Kult and various other organizations that will give enough money to get by, so they're not reliant on having some rich person like their work or whatnot. They can actually create what they want to in keeping with these Bolshevik ideals. So Marxism in Russia, especially in the 1920s, looks very different from what we know of it from later on, from the Stalinist period and afterwards. Okay. This is not apparent in the West, right? Because as of 1917, the U.S. gets into it. As of 1918, you have 10,000 American troops arriving in Europe per day, and this then is going to overthrow. And this then is sort of the Germans are unable to compete any longer with the Allies once the U.S. is involved. Once all these fresh troops are pouring into the combat on the Western Front. Right? So the thing is that in the immediate wake of the war ending in November, we have the Spartacist rebellion in Germany, where the communists try to overthrow the government. And also in Hungary, in 1919, there is a communist republic from March till August, I think, or thereabouts. So the thing is that from the standpoint of the Western powers, it looks as though this communist threat that has started out in Petrograd and Moscow might well be spreading all throughout all of Europe. Okay, so basically global security and trying to establish some sort of prophylactic barrier against Marxism is very much on the minds of Wilson and the other peacemakers at Versailles. Okay, they want to make sure how to, they're trying to cordon off the rest of Europe from what they see as the dangerous threat of Marxist takeover. Okay. So to Wilson, of course, his 14 points is sort of the guiding logic of the Paris Peace Conference or Versailles. He wants to see no more secret treaties, that is, open covenants freely arrived at between nations. He wants to see arms reductions, which everybody involved promptly ignores, of course. He wants to see the League of Nations founded, which happens, and then we don't join it because the Senate doesn't vote to ratify the treaty. We're going to blame Germany for everything, although, as we all know, World War I it's not just the Germans' fault. Nothing is that simple. Poland comes back to the map as well. But the most important thing that Wilson articulates in the 14 points in terms of how things shake out in Europe afterwards, which also incidentally earns him the Nobel Peace Prize in 1919, is the idea of national self-determination. Okay, that is sort of the key point of those 14 points, is that the peoples of Austria-Hungary, whose place among the nations we wish to see safeguarded and assured, should be accorded the freest opportunity to autonomous development. Okay, so we're going to take this big multinational empire, and we're going to cut it apart into nation states. Well, so the Czechs and Slovaks get their Czechoslovakia, Hungary gets Hungary, Romania, so on and so forth. Good idea, right? People get to live in a state of their own nationality. They won't be driven to conflict with each other. On the surface, a great idea, but folks, here's a ethnic linguistic map of Austria-Hungary. Let's take a moment and look at it. Blue is the Czechs, all mostly in one place. Slovaks over there. Ruthenians, Ukrainians basically over there. So some of these peoples can be split off into nation states pretty readily, but the pink is ethnic Germans. They're spread all throughout Austria, the periphery of the Czech lands, pockets all throughout Hungary and Romania. Hungarians, meanwhile, have 1 million some odd living over in Transylvania. There's no way to draw borders that will ensure entirely homogenous nation states. You're going to have national minorities regardless of how you draw the lines, unless you pick people up and move it and put them on the road for elsewhere, right? So the premise of national self-determination, that each nation should have their own nation state, founders upon the complexity of national development and diversity in Eastern Europe. Are y'all with me on that? That there's no way to draw lines here where everybody gets to live in a nation of their own choosing without having to move around, right? So this, the empire is dissolved. The brown part was formerly part of the Austrian half that splits up into Czechoslovakia, Poland, Austria, parts go to Italy. And then the other part that was formerly the Hungarian half is much is taken by the Romanians, the Slovaks, and the new Kingdom of Serbs, Croatians, and Slovenes, later Yugoslavia, right? So you can imagine how, say, the Austrians feel about this, having gone from half of a mighty empire to a much, much smaller state. You can see how the Hungarians feel about that. You know, here's this very graphic representation of the formerly Hungarian half of the empire being torn apart by Czechoslovakia, Romania, Yugoslavia. And in each of those regions, there's millions of minorities, there's millions of Hungarians who were previously on the top in the Hungarian half of the empire, now being subordinate to other national groups, right? This is why in Hungary, for the interwar period, Nem Nem Soha is sort of this motto or rallying cry. That is, we'll never accept the border set down at Versailles. We'll never accept this truncation of our once great empire. We'll do whatever we have to change it. So along comes Hitler, and Hungarians are going to be willing allies because he promises to give them back some of their old land, right? I'm getting ahead of myself. Hitler is not a big star of the story just yet. But the point is that okay, so here's again a map of Europe on the eve of the war, and then after the war, those are the territories ceded to new states. So the Baltics, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, and then look at how big Czechoslovakia is. Okay, it's much larger than, it's larger than its more modern boundaries before it split apart in the 90s. But this is a relatively large, relatively powerful regional state, as are Poland and Romania and Yugoslavia. And the reason for that comes back to this sort of Red Scare that I was talking about, is that the victor powers, France and the UK primarily, want to see a strong buffer zone between this newly communist state in the Far East and Central Europe, Germany, and the like, right? So this in essence creates the opening for our second major figure for today, Tamás Gárdonyi Masaryk, to jump into it and agitate for a powerful independent Czechoslovakia. Let's okay, there's a map without the colors. Again, numerous new nation states founded in the wake of the collapse of four empires: German, Russian, Austro-Hungarian, Ottoman, right? So back to national minorities. This is where Wilson's vision of national self-determination founders on the vision of Britain and France of wanting a strong ally in Central Europe, right? They want to make sure that Czechoslovakia is strong enough to fend off resurgent Germany or something at some point, so they go ahead and make it much larger than the actual Czech lands themselves. These regions, the Sudetenland, are 80 to 90 to 100% ethnic German. 3 million ethnic Germans find themselves living in Czechoslovakia instead of Germany after World War I. And this is after one of the tenets of the peace treaty was national self-determination. So they feel robbed, of course, and they're going to be agitating for unification with ethnic Germany well before Hitler comes to power. Okay? So this brings us to Masaryk, who's the first prime minister of Czechoslovakia after World War I. And he's important for a couple of reasons. That is, he is a very skilled politician. And he's in essence trying to, and he's able to, and he's well liked by the Allies that he can convince them to give him this large, pretty powerful Czechoslovakia. It is mostly Czechs and Slovaks, but I mean there's this substantial German minority, also Hungarians, Poles, and Ruthenians, Ukrainians, in the south and east. So this is a very multinational state for what's supposed to be a national self-determined region. But Masaryk is a very popular figure. His popularity stems back to late 19th century when he was involved in, the Hilsner blood libel trial. Let me back up. most of you probably recall the Dreyfus affair from European history, right? There's Alfred Dreyfus, the French Jewish officer, was accused of having sold secrets to the Germans, and this was this whole sort of wave of anti-Semitism apparent in France. The same type of anti-Semitism surfaces in the late 19th century, but in Eastern Central Europe, it takes the form of various trials for supposed blood libel. That is, in the Hilsner trial in the Czech lands, there was a who knows what the so-called blood libel is? Anyway, does anybody know this? This is a bizarre little Oh, no, it's Christians and Jews. That's exactly right. It's a sort of this medieval superstition held by Christians that for Passover and other religious ceremonies, the Jews will kidnap and murder Christian children to use their blood in making their various Passover foodstuffs. To the best of our knowledge, this is not the case, of course, but in the spirit of heightened anti-Semitism towards the end of the 19th century, this made a lot of sense to people. If some child went missing, blame the local Jews and then go on a pogrom against where they live, right? So Masaryk became famous for defending one of these people accused of being guilty of the so-called blood libel, actually succeeded in getting him acquitted. He also defended various political opponents of the empire, so that by the time World War I rolled around, he was widely seen as the father of Czechoslovaks in Europe. He was also well liked by the Western powers, but because he promised to be a very solid ally. He also, and again, that strong Czechoslovakia is going to act as a counterweight against a resurgent Germany or other threats in Eastern Central Europe. Okay, so there's a case study in how both sort of his own personal individual charisma and political skill was part of how he becomes the leader of Czechoslovakia, of a very powerful Czechoslovakia. But this is also but this is also possible because this is convenient for the victorious powers at Versailles. Okay, it's a combination of both this broader diplomatic picture and also his own personal charisma. So, having built Czechoslovakia, Masaryk now turns to how to create this new state from the ruins of the Austrian Empire and what to do with all these national minorities in his midst, or in their midst. Now, the thing is that Masaryk has a pretty good reputation as a very egalitarian, fair-minded, democratic ruler, and I'm going to ruin that for you now by talking about how he treated the ethnic German minority in Sudetenland, okay? Now, this is the Sudetendeutsch, again, 3 million ethnic Germans living in that western periphery of the Czech lands, previously part of the ethnic national elite of the empire, now reduced to subordinate minority status. Okay, so there's in essence an inversion where the Germans used to be on top, and now they're subordinate to the Czechs. Now, in questions of nationalism in Eastern and Central Europe, language always plays a huge part. And the law for the new Czechoslovak state was that as long as a region is less than 10% ethnic German, we don't have to have a German language school in that region. We can just do Czech instruction in Czech all throughout the regions that have less than 10% ethnic Germans. Okay, so this is... this then leads to the census coming through in 1920, in which people were encouraged to identify as Czechs and discouraged from identifying as Germans. In some cases, people even had their national identity forcibly changed by the courts. So people would claim to be German, and they would go to court, and the judge would say, "Well, sure, you speak German at home and at the workplace, and your mother is German, but your father is Czech. Therefore, you're a Czech." And then you have to pay a fine or even do jail time for having been mistaken about your national identity. People's national identity was changed by courts on them without their consent in the Sudetenland in this time period. Here's the other thing is that, we tend to think about nationalism as defining people as absolutely Czech or German, absolutely American or Russian. But the fact is, in these borderlands of empire, many people had a German parent, one German and one Czech parent, or one Czech and one Slovak parent. They didn't have any distinct national identity per se. They were what we call nationally indifferent. So the Czechs come around promising that, if you send your child to this Czech school, they're going to get free food and warm clothes at Christmas time, in essence bribing families to raise their children as one or the other nationality. Profoundly undemocratic, coercive means coming from the Masaryk's government, right? Does it get worse? Of course it does. Because Masaryk, the Czech state also encourages ethnic German Jews to declare themselves to be Jews instead of Germans, to further erode the numbers of Germans, to get those minority language schools unnecessary. But the problem with that is that when the Nazis come along in World War II, their work has already been done for them. That is, the population has been sorted into Jew and non-Jew, and they can just round them up and finish the work the Czechs started, in essence. And lastly, the means by which ethnic Germans, or so-called national amphibians, the nationally indifferent, the means by which they were surveilled or came to the attention of the courts and police, it wasn't through police actions for the most part. It was from their neighbors ratting them out, denouncing them as they sending the kid to the Czech school or otherwise, transgressing these laws of belonging to the nation. So my point here is that in the supposedly democratic state led by Tamás Gárdonyi Masaryk, so this guiding icon of democratic rule in Central Europe, we already have the forcible ascription of nationalities, people being told what nationality they are against their will. We have Jews being singled out as a social category, which will eventually come back to haunt the Jewish population in this region. And lastly, we have people who are denouncing their neighbors and spying on them in the name of this greater national ambition. And this is all happening in the Czech lands, not in Germany as yet. Any questions on that? Again, I think claims that Masaryk is a very democratic ruler don't take into account this sort of like battle for nationality happening on the fringes of the Czech lands in this Sudetenland. Okay, so Marxism, Masaryk. I want to go ahead and wrap up and talk about King Alexander's monkey. Bear with me as I explain what's going on between Greece and Turkey at this time. Okay, now let's see. Greece, of course, has Greece's history dates back to antiquity, right, with the city-states of Athens, Sparta, and the rest. And Greece had also been one of the first states in Eastern Central Europe to gain independence from the Ottoman Empire in 1832. Yes? I'm sorry? Oh, wait, the American invasion of Russia. Was it that disastrous? I'll tell you what. Let's come back to that in the question and answer. Okay, I want to finish up with a very famous monkey here, and we'll come back to that. Okay, but let's see. So Greece is glorious in antiquity. They're also one of the first states to gain their independence from the Ottoman Empire in 1832. So going into World War I, the Greeks are looking to acquire even more territory. That is, the Balkan Wars in 1812 and 1813 had gained some territory for the Greeks there in the Aegean littoral. But this isn't enough for the Greeks, because the Greek national idea in this heyday of nationalism was that the modern Greek nation state should adhere to the megali idea, or the great idea, the big idea in in Greek, meaning that the modern Greek state should, the borders of it should be the same as those of the Byzantine Empire. Okay, so stretching back along the Black Sea ways into Syria, North Africa, and the rest, they envision a substantial modern Greek state. Excuse me, rather than just what they have so far. Initial wins in the Balkan Wars, but they want more. Here's a so here is a piece of propaganda put out by Eleftherios Venizelos, the Prime Minister of Greece, showing in 1910 that's how much Greece controls. As 1920, it's almost tripled in size, and for Venizelos, this is enough. The Greeks should stop and consolidate their gains, and instead of seizing even more territory. Okay, to back up to the war, though, the Turks do very, very poorly in World War I, as we all know probably. They do survive the ill planned Allied invasion of Gallipoli in 1915, but crumble swiftly thereafter. Okay. Now, as the Ottoman Empire collapses, this guy here, Kemal Ataturk, gathers together some of the remaining forces of the Turkish army. He manages to form, in essence, the kernel of the future secular Turkish state. Ruled by him, okay? But in the meantime, though, all of what is modern Turkey is in chaos, and there are pretty powerful Greek armies along the shoreline who are seizing more and more land throughout the course of 1920, and thereafter, okay? This is where, okay, Greek politics are complicated and confusing, as then as now, but on the eve of World War I, Greek is a constitutional monarchy. They have a monarch, but also a parliament with a prime minister. And Greek politics prior to World War I are pretty much the king Constantine, who's a fan of the Germans, squaring off against Venizelos, who's a fan of the British. Okay, so going into World War I, the king would like to enter the war on the side of the Germans, Venizelos on the side of the British, and he actually conspires with the British to kick Constantine out of power and then rule basically through Constantine's son Alexander. This is staging a palace coup in 1916 to bring Greece into the war on the side of the Triple Entente, or the Allies, right? Constantine is not killed, however. He is merely set into exile. Why does this matter? This matters because World War I winds down in the Eastern Mediterranean with the Greeks and Turks, in essence, at war. There's Greeks trying to seize more and more territory, the Turks trying to hang desperately onto whatever they can. Whereas in Greek politics, you've got the king Alexander, who's pretty much the patsy of Venizelos, the prime minister, but Constantine is lurking in the background, hoping to stage a return to power. Okay? So, 1920, the proposed Treaty of Sèvres, this would have partitioned Turkey in this manner. The Turks get that much territory, and then much of the rest of it is occupied by the Italians, the French, or the British, and those few remaining Armenians would even get some land for themselves. But this would have been a win for Greece. Okay, this would have been substantial. This would have resulted in Greece acquiring pretty substantial territories. And again, most of this population is ethnic Greek, so the Greeks have a valid claim to this region. So going into 1920, we've got many Greeks enthusiastic about trying to seize more land, making Greece even bigger and better than it was before. We've got Venizelos saying, enough is enough. Let's go ahead and take it slow and consolidate our gains before we try to seize more territory. And Alexander is Alexander is the king. He's basically a patsy of Venizelos, but Constantine is waiting to see what he can do in the background. So King Alexander has a pet dog. He's walking in the royal garden with it one day, and a couple of monkeys that have escaped from the royal zoo attack his dog. King Alexander tries to fend off the monkeys. He's bit by one of them, catches sepsis, and dies in 3 days. The monkey did not have a gun. It just had a disease. I just love that picture. But here's the thing. This results in a total sea change in Greek politics as a result of a monkey bite. Because Alexander gone, Venizelos is out of power, Constantine comes back. Constantine gets rid of the people who support Venizelos, many of them the officers who actually know how to stage assaults and things like that, and decides to resume the drive on Ankara, trying to knock the Turks out of the Greco-Turkish war. Who wants to guess what happens next? The Greeks are overextended. They end up having a disastrous loss at Sakarya, and thereafter the Turkish forces push them right into the Aegean. Literally, as the result of a monkey bite, this changes the fortunes, this changes the outcome of the Greco-Turkish war. Now, the other important thing about this conflict is that with the Treaty of Lausanne that ends the war, we have a massive population transfer. That is, the 0.5 million Turks remaining in Europe are forced out of Europe into Turkey. The 1.5 million ethnic Greeks living mostly in Istanbul and on that western periphery also are forced to pick up and move to Greece. So this is generating hundreds of thousands of refugees. It's a brutal process, but it also gets rid of the national minority problem that's going to plague other European states in the interwar period. Greece and Turkey don't get along that well after World War I. look at, say, the Cyprus conflict or other things, but there's not the same kind of national minorities plaguing Greco-Turkish relations as there are, say, between the Germans and the Czechs thereafter, right? So this population exchange, albeit brutal in the short term, creating refugees, in the longer term goes some ways towards ensuring there aren't major nationality conflicts between the two powers thereafter, okay? And this gets important, just sort of wrapping things up here, that purple shaded region is the Sudetenland, again, home to 3 million ethnic Germans. Hitler's going to come to power in 1933. He's going to remilitarize Germany. He's going to absorb Austria on the Anschluss in 1938, and then he's going to meet Britain and France at Munich, demanding the incorporation of the Sudetenland into his Third Reich. Part of his rationale for doing so is going back to Wilsonian principles of national self-determination. These ethnic Germans should live in an ethnic German state. So, so Hitler's, of course, he has bolder ambitions in mind, but the premise for his demanding the Sudetenland is precisely the principle that was supposedly followed drawing borders at Versailles, okay? And this is also important because look at all these small, new, fragile democracies founded in the wake of the collapse of empires after World War I. Here's the thing. Between extreme nationalism on the rise in the 20s and 30s and then the Great Depression in 29, this is going to result in the collapse of democracy and the takeover by either a military or a monarchic authoritarian leader in every last country in Eastern and Central Europe well before World War II starts. So nationalism and democracy, between the Great Depression and nationalist extremism, we're going to see democracy and capitalism fail all throughout Eastern and Central Europe. Every one of those states goes from being a democracy with universal suffrage, with sort of a very progressive-minded politics, to being run by a dictator of one flavor or another. With the exception of Czechoslovakia, and that's what makes the Munich Conference such a profound irony. They would have been a great ally in World War II. They had a pretty strong army. They were ready to fight the Germans, and instead the West just sold them out at Munich. But by this point, I'm getting very far ahead of myself. Let me back it up. When and why things happen. There's a baby picture of Hitler for your enjoyment there on the other side. So we've seen the long and short-term causes, right? One of the causes for the Bolshevik Revolution was this idea of Marxism that ferments throughout the course of the late 19th century, then explodes into realization in 1917. Shorter-term causes for the Russian Revolution include World War I, incompetence on the Tsar's part, and the various crises that result from that war. More broadly, in terms of, say, Greco-Turkish relations, we have sort of this longer history of centuries that is then distilled down into the specific context of the immediate post-war period. But on top of these long and short-term causes, we have to include the proximate cause, the actual trigger or that spark that lights off the powder keg. The assassination of the Archduke Franz Ferdinand by Gavrilo Princip in 1914 is one of those, and then King Alexander's monkey is another, right? I mean, just through sheer accident, there's no other way to put it, the fates of millions of people was determined, right? In terms of causation, I think there's the great man versus broad social forces kind of debate in history. That is history the result of individuals, certain powerful individuals, Napoleon, Hitler, and the rest doing certain things, sort of a Nietzschean vision, versus is it more a question of social forces working themselves out, industrialization, capitalism, national identity, things like that. And I think that we see how both elements play a part here, and especially in Masaryk's story. Right? By all accounts, a very popular politician, a very competent one, but if it hadn't been for the great powers wanting him to have a powerful state, he probably would have ended up with a much, much weaker one. So it's a combination of both individual causes and broader forces afoot. But then lastly, again, just as sometimes it, the over and above, I mean, historians, we like to convince ourselves that we can figure out why things happen, identify causes, and say that A caused B, then C, then D, and what have you. And for this tendency on the part of historians to rationalize things, I would just like to bring the monkey back into it. You know, I mean, once the role of sheer accident in history, that it is possible for a monkey bite to totally change how things turn out. That's what I got for you. Thanks for listening. Yeah.
So you want to start with, finishing up this question. You want to say the question here so that the audience can hear your question?
What's that?
Did you want to repeat your question so he can address it, but so others can hear it?
Yeah.
The American invasion of Russia.
You mean in Archangel in 1919, 1918?
Right.
It wasn't all that
was-
disastrous. It didn't matter much, I didn't think.
It did in the sense that the Russians never forgot it.
Oh, well, yeah.
They were very bitter about that because, of course, it was an attempt to overthrow the Bolsheviks.
Well, see, that's actually a very good point because, I mean, the Western powers are really concerned about Lenin and his cohort, right? This is when Churchill says, now is the time to strangle the infant Bolshevism in its cradle. Kind of a creepy image from this great hero of British history.
Well, they never forgot that.
Sure, but I think that's more like a later propaganda creation that is what actually, I mean, we're talking thousands of American troops who were there for less than a year. So it's kind of, it just did. Right. So it's more the idea of it later than the actual fact of intervention, at the time that mattered. I think that's a totally valid point. Yes.
Other questions?
Yeah, hi there.
Let me bring you the
We have
microphone
a
so we
microphone
can hear
for
it.
you.
The Holy Roman Empire helped keep the Austrians going for a long time. Why do you think it wasn't that useful for, was it the rise of Lutheranism and that sort of thing?
Oh, well, first off, I'm a 20th century historian, but no, I can answer that. The Holy Roman Empire basically follows after Charlemagne in the 800s, and the Habsburgs control it from, about 1282 on, right? So you're right, that for much of the medieval into the early modern, into the modern period, the Holy Roman Empire is a very important element in Central European politics. Protestantism is a problem, as you mentioned. That is, the Holy Roman Empire remains mostly Catholic. Most of the states split off are Protestant. But I think the real thing that kills it is the rise of nationalism, right? Because, I mean, as long as people identify as imperial subjects, you're pretty cool taking marching orders from the emperor, powerful empire. We're part of that. That's a good thing. Once you start thinking about how that emperor is oppressing your fellow Hungarians or Czechs or Slovaks or Slovenes or Romanians or whatever other group, once we identify as part of a national group rather than a subject of empire, I think that's probably the major thing that destroys the empire. Right. Thank you. Good question.
Other questions?
You said at the beginning that Russia was about, if I recall correctly, you gave us a lot of information, 80% agrarian.
On the eve of World War I, Russia is the population is 80% peasant and 50% illiterate.
Okay.
So 4 in 5 Russians are living on the land, working in agriculture, most often in little better than serf status for nobles.
And so the Bolsheviks were mainly trying to organize workers and middle class, and the agrarian,
Not the middle class, but the workers mostly.
the workers.
Yeah.
Well,
Sorry, and then Lenin's vision is that the workers, once they're radical enough, can actually get those peasants and get them to be radical too. So this is one of the major ways that Lenin changes Marxism to fit the Russian context, right? If he goes with a doctrinaire Marxism saying the workers are the solution, then there's just no reason to have a revolution in Russia, right? Go to Germany and try it there.
yeah.
But the idea that we can have the peasants and workers work together for revolution, that's one of the ways that Lenin justifies starting the revolution in Russia.
What I'm worrying about in my little head is that the peasants, the serfs, were never part of any of this movement. They just got taken advantage of from beginning to end.
That is totally accurate. One of the ways the Bolsheviks win the Civil War is by promising peace, land, and bread. That is, we'll get out of World War I, which they do. We'll feed you, which they try. And they promise them land. They say, hey, peasants, you can have your own private farms. You can own your own private property. which is obviously them just basically pandering to the peasants' self-interest. They never had the slightest intention of letting him keep those farms, and that's why along comes 1928. Stalin's in power. He collectivizes agriculture, and this is when a lot of those peasants who supported the Reds during the Civil War find themselves being sent off to forced labor camps, and millions die in the course of it. So he is absolutely right. The peasants would get the short end of the stick. No
Okay.
question about it.
Then I have another question
Sure.
about the Japanese. What happened to them? Did they just turn around and start working on China and leave Russia behind?
You mean in 1905?
Yeah.
Yeah. They had managed to. The U.S. comes in and arbitrates the treaty between the Russians and the Japanese. So the Japanese don't really gain that much out of the war, aside from a striking victory over a major European power, right? So for the Japanese in the 1894-95, they defeat China in the Sino-Japanese War, and that's when they take Taiwan, Okinawa, and various other islands in that neck of the woods. And then thereafter, they do pretty much focus on China, trying to. They really don't get started on China till the 1930s. Ironically enough, Japan joins our side at the very end of the war, and then after the war, when the great powers are dividing up all the German colonies, all those German islands off in the Pacific go to the Japanese. So they basically make out like gangbusters in World War I. They jump in the last minute, no real casualties. They have their stepping stones for Pearl Harbor as of 1918.
Other
Yeah.
questions? Okay, sure. Just a second here.
Not to be a harp, but the American invasion of Russia in 1919 into development stock, the Russians never forgot that. They were very bitter. The invasion was in support of the white Russians. The communists were very bitter about that.
Oh, sure. I mean, I wouldn't contest that for a second. I just think that. I mean, disaster. I mean, not the same as say like Dunkirk or something. I mean, it was. I think politically it mattered somewhat, but again, we're talking more about afterwards. The narrative told by the Bolsheviks made it more significant than it actually was. We're talking a couple thousand troops that were there for less than a year, which compared to the various other forces arrayed against the Bolsheviks, we're talking tens of thousands of Cossacks, 40,000 Czechs in the Czech Legion. I mean, this was really kind of a sideshow in the Civil War. Now it's late. Yes, later on it's made to be a big deal. That is true. True. Oh, they've got lots of other things to be bitter about since then, don't they? Yeah. He had a question.
Oh, I'm sorry. We're here.
Yeah.
I can't see your hands. Yeah, that's okay. It's okay.
I've enjoyed a musical called Fiddler on the Roof, but
Not
it's
gonna
made me wonder just how Jewish was the Russian Revolution.
Whoa, that is a heavily loaded question. Many of the leaders were Jewish, but for instance, like Trotsky, Lev Davidovich Bronstein originally, right? I mean, so many of them come from Jewish backgrounds. They're more concerned with their identity as revolutionaries, as class revolutionaries, rather than their Jewish ethnic or religious identity. So a significant number of them were from Jewish origins, but they wouldn't identify as such, I don't think. And actually went to great pains to make sure that there was, to make sure that they weren't perceived as being unduly Jewish, if you will.
Were they mostly peasants, the Jews, or were they industrial?
Wait, the Bolsheviks?
Yeah, with the Bolsheviks.
Okay, the
No, the Jews, the Jewish population
in Russia.
in Russia.
Mostly agricultural, mostly living in the shtetl, or sort of small villages off in the Pale of Settlement, which is modern Poland and Belarus. About over 3 million. The bulk of European Jews live in what is today Eastern Poland, Belarus, Ukraine at the time. sorry, the book that existed before the Holocaust. Yeah.
Other questions?
We had a question in the back.
Oh, sure.
The Tatlin Monument.
What city is that in?
Oh dear, that was a model that was built. It was never actually constructed.
Well, what city was it going to be? What was it planned for?
Leningrad. Yeah. Like so many other things about the revolution, it looked great on paper, but they never quite managed to get it built, right? Other questions? These are great. You guys are better than my normal students.
That's
Oh,
what we
here's
always say about our Fairhaven audience.
You mentioned the role of education, enlightenment, and literacy
Sure.
back then. Nowadays, China's putting a lot of emphasis on education, especially at high level. Just had an opportunity to spend a few days in Cuba, highly literate, very strong emphasis on education. So I guess my question is, it's kind of like, how can you keep them down on the farm when they've seen Paris? As these populations become more educated and perhaps creative, what effect might that have on the communism and the Marxism models?
That's well, give me a sec. Okay. Broadly speaking, the major revolutions in history happen around the tipping point where populations pass the 50% literacy mark. The same's true of the U.S., France, and England. Okay. So just for what it's worth. Now, so I mean, broadly speaking, it's tempting to argue that, and those are all revolutions going towards democracy, right? Towards democratic systems. I mean, the thing also, the thing to keep in mind is that, I mean, Marxism is supposed to be a democratic system. Everyone has an equal share in everything, an equal vote in everything. I mean, again, on paper, that's what it's supposed to be. But I think that, so I think that there's that promise that I think is promulgated by the Bolsheviks in Russia, that we're going to educate you as well as everything else. And then, I mean, look, more people get educated in the 30s in the Soviet Union than had prior to World War I. They're educated in a very hidebound, narrow vision Marxist manner. You know, they have to study their 1,000-page volumes of Kapital, which I just would not wish on anybody, communist or otherwise. But I mean, these communist states also educate their denizens. I mean, when communism takes over in Eastern Europe, we're talking mostly peasant populations who've been kept on the land. We're talking women mostly kept subservient, and things like that. So communists come along and they say, look, we have quotas for women in the workplace and universities. We have quotas for the peasantry as well. They're actually going to make a real effort towards educating people, but it's educating in a Marxist communist context, which we tend to see as brainwashing. But then, I mean, all education is brainwashing in one sense or another. I'll shut up there. Other questions?
Any other questions?
Hey, here's one.
Sure.
Will there be a quiz next week?
Nope. Y'all get A's just for showing up.
That's a great question, a great way to end it. I think we'll end our Q&A there. We can stay around and chat a little bit. And if we did get a lot of information from Dr. Brown today. The video of this lecture will be on our website in about a week. If you've missed any of the lectures, they're all on our website now. Thanks to Austin in the back, who is actually graduating, so he won't be here next semester.
Oh, no.
But we appreciate all of his help, and you can watch any of our lectures from this series. But please join me in thanking Dr. Brown for his lecture today.